Good afternoon and welcome to the first in a series of webinars from the ZDL Group, which we've entitled Navigating the Changing Landscape of Data Privacy and Security. We're going to be taking a look back today at the GDPR. It's been in place for 5 years, and we're going to try and have a look and see what impact it's had on the privacy landscape, both from a financial and a security perspective. We're going to take a trip down memory lane to understand how we got here, and we're going to have a peek into the future and see where we might be headed. I'm Steve Giacardi. I am the Senior Information Security Manager, and I think I'm only senior because I'm the oldest member of the team. And in that respect, I'm joined by the spry Kevin Swatridge. Kevin, say hi to people.
Hi Steve, hi, I'm Kevin Swatridge. I'm a Senior Information Security Consultant here with ZDL Group. And much like Steve, I spend my life helping organizations achieve their security and privacy goals with lots of years of experience in governance, risk and compliance, and helping them with incident response and scaring C-suite teams with all of the horrible things that could happen, and hopefully helping them on their journeys to achieve certification against all those lovely standards provided by ISO and such like. Steve.
Thank you, Kev. As mentioned, we're going to be looking at the evolution of data privacy. So how we came to have, or the need to have, something like the GDPR. We're going to look at the cost of GDPR from both the compliance and non-compliance aspects. And then we're going to take a look at what we've learned from this, and if anything, from the regulation. And then we'll have a little look at where data privacy is headed, in our opinion, and what we think will be the next steps for data security. So really, this journey begins way back in 1984, when the UK passed the Data Protection Act, which was one of the first laws in the world to regulate the collection, use and disclosure of personal data. And this, of course, was based on the principles of the Council of Europe Convention 108, which was signed in 1981 and entered into force in 1985. So the 1984 UK DPA aimed to protect the rights and freedoms of individuals regarding the processing of their personal data by controllers and processors. And in 1995, the EU Data Protection Directive was adopted to harmonise data protection laws across the EU member states and to ensure the free flow of personal data within the borders of the EU. Now, this was really where the first data subject rights were put in place, because it was this charter that brought in the right to access, the right to rectify, and the right to erase personal data. The problem was that none of us really knew much about it at that time, and I don't think anybody really exercised those rights back in the day. And the 1995 directive also established the Article 29 Working Party. This was an independent advisory body composed of representatives from the national data protection authorities of each of the different EU member states. While all this was happening, the UK updated the UK Data Protection Act and replaced it with the 1998 version. And this implemented all of the controls that Europe had put in place through the Data Protection Directive from 1995. And it also extended the scope of data protection to cover manual as well as automated processing of personal data, and created a new supervisory authority, our lovely ICO. And in 2000, we got to the state of the International Safe Harbour Framework, which was where the EU and the US agreed that we could exchange data. And the US certified that participating US companies adhered to a set of privacy principles that were deemed adequate by the EU. In 2012, the European Commission announced its plans to develop the GDPR, but there was a bit of a faux pas along the way, because 2015, there was the allegations or the release of data by Snowden, which showed that the US intelligence agencies were not really dealing with data as was prescribed in Europe, And so the safe harbour framework was overruled, known as the Schrems 1 case, saying that it didn't provide sufficient protection for the data from EU citizens. In 2016, the US Privacy Shield replaced Safe Harbour. And again, this said that the US companies adhered to a set of privacy principles that were deemed adequate and met the EU standards. We know what happened to that. And the GDPR was approved in 2016 to come into play. And this added the final three rights for data subjects. This added the right to data portability, the right to object, and the right to be forgotten, which really makes up the 6 rights that data subjects have under the GDPR. They also prescribed that companies that were handling a lot of personal data should have data protection officers in place, and that there should be a timeline for people to report breaches. The European Data Protection Board replaced the Article 29 Working Party, who was set up back in 1995, and the 2018 Data Protection Act, the UK Data Protection Act, was drafted to accommodate the changes made by the GDPR. 2020 saw some changes as well because Schrems 2 came into play, and poor US had to take Privacy Shield away. They're still working out how they can transfer data from Europe into America. And in 2021, following Brexit, we had the EU-UK adequacy decisions, which were adopted by the EU Commission. They were approved by the EU member states and recognised that the UK's data protection regime provides an essentially equivalent level of protection to the one provided within the EU. So the adequacy decisions cover both the UK GDPR and are expected to last until 2025, and they're subject to periodic reviews and possible suspensions or withdrawal by the EU Commission. But I think at least we're able to transfer data around with our European friends. Bit of a journey, hasn't it, Kev?
Oh, absolutely, Steve. And I was just looking at those dates, and you know, we started this particular leg of the journey 40 years ago, and as per this slide, it genuinely was a filing cabinet universe at the point that we started this journey into data privacy, all the way through to where we are today. But you know, obviously the primary thing that we've seen since the introduction of GDPR really is that kind of globalization of data regulations, and how that step into that realm has enabled other regions, countries to define their own data regulations that are based on, around, and in some instances extend against the GDPR requirements that were put together. And so, you know, especially as you mentioned with regards to the US and such, like with the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, where we're starting to see a more kind of interconnected and kind of networked approach to the data privacy landscape. So, and what we've really kind of seen with that is the increasing focus on individual rights. So modern data legislation really focuses on the data subject, or PII principle, however you want to refer to them, as king in that environment, that's their data, it's their rights as to how it's going to be used, and the legislation is there to protect them and offer them the capability to access, review, remove, delete, amend, and provide all important consent to use of the data that they are sharing with organizations. Obviously, what we've seen and the things that the news likes to focus on, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is enforcement that's set around those, and the fines that have made headlines in terms of data protection authorities and regulators bringing to bear where the consequences of not being compliant to those legislations. And substantial fines have been levied against a number of organizations in really high profile cases, especially involving tech giants that we work with and share our data on an ongoing basis. And some of the other really positive things that we've seen, the concepts of the emergence of privacy by design has really been driven by privacy legislation and the need for organizations to bake in the requirements to protect data and to ensure its privacy on an ongoing basis. This is really about at the drawing board of producing applications and websites and services, that privacy is central to its creation and the way in which we expect those kind of services to work. And the other thing it's really driving is technological advancements in both in terms of data privacy. We've seen the increase in data loss prevention tools that are monitoring our networks and systems to ensure that there isn't unnecessary leakage, that's being now managed and effectively controlled by AIs with machine learning capabilities in order to protect our data in the most effective way that doesn't require huge teams of people to be able to monitor many screens on an ongoing basis. We've seen the introduction of security components such as biometrics. You know, when I was starting this journey, the thought of fingerprint identification was something I saw in James Bond movies, and now, you know, it's something you do every day. And of course, how that expands to the increasing and growing network of the Internet of Things. So how do you apply privacy to a connected toaster? Is it relevant that somebody could tap into that and understand what's going on? But it also extends to all of the other connected devices that we have, from doorbells to smart speakers and fridges that automatically top themselves up through online retailers.
I feel there's a pun to be made about smart speakers and webinars, but I don't know what it is at the moment.
This is the not smart speaker component.
So what's the difference between security and privacy then, Kevin? Is there a difference?
There is a difference, and it is to an extent relatively subtle, but it is they are great bedfellows, for want of a better phrase. And privacy really is the right to control how your personal information and data is collected, stored, used, shared, and processed by the people that we choose to engage with. And then the security component is around the protection of that data and to prevent unauthorized access to that data. So if you've got really good security, then the chances are you're already taking a step into having better privacy. And what we're seeing on an ongoing basis with the clients that we work with is where they have established strong security credentials and a robust security posture, what's next really is, how do I now extend that to putting a wrapper of privacy around that? But fundamentally, you can't have privacy without security. You can have it the other way around. You could be secure and not private, but privacy really is that component that ensures that the people in your organization and those outside of your organization are limited in their access to confidential information, and in the case of GDPR, that's PII.
Hmm. And there are 7 foundational principles of privacy, you tell me. Can you run through
Well,
them for us?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we mentioned privacy by design, and that is a critical component of how you introduce a privacy information management system, or what we would call a PIMS, which would sit alongside and interact with your security management system. And
Here's me
that,
thinking of things was a refreshing summer drink. You're telling me it's a privacy information management system?
I'm sorry if I've ruined it for you, but yeah, your summer days are now going to be far more interesting when you stare into your PIMS watching the cricket. But it's proactive. It's not reactive. It's the thought process that goes into the design of your products and services to ensure that you're not responding to a breach, but you are preventing that from ever happening. And we say privacy by default does what it says on the tin. It is the default settings. So when you access a service, an app, or a system, the most private configuration is set by default, and you have to choose to reduce your privacy controls as opposed to add them on. So by default, you are as private as can be. And it's embedded into design. So it's part of the user experience, the process at which an application or system is working, and sits at the core of the concept of how it works, what it does, to provide the most privacy it can. And this point about full functionality, the positive sum, not a zero sum. Essentially, my interpretation of that really is the fact that everybody benefits. Whatever happens, the functionality of the system ensures that those that own it and use it and operate it and process the data benefit from the security and privacy functionality within that system. And then we're talking around that end-to-end security, so full life cycle protection. So the security components that are mandatory for you to achieve the levels of privacy that you're after are there throughout the function of the product and services. That's the onboarding process, the clicking of the yes, I choose to opt in. Yes, I've signed up to your privacy policy. Yes, I understand the security implications of using this product, all the way through to ending that process. What happens to my data should I choose to stop using your service? Do you delete it? Do you obfuscate it? Do you keep it for reference purposes, and for how long? The whole life cycle of my data in your service is understood, and the limitations of how you can use it and the ways in which you are able to dispose of it are clear and transparent to me as a user. The visibility and transparency, absolutely. Be clear, be open, be honest. Tell people what you're going to do with their data. Enable them to make an informed choice about how they are going to interact with you. The reality is we still live in a universe where we are offered the opportunity to read the terms and conditions of the privacy policies. Some of us do, most of us don't. But the fact is, it is available to us and is a mandatory requirement as laid down by regulations like GDPR to ensure that we are offering up that information should people need to understand it. And that final component, the user is king. The PII principle, the data subject, the individual, their rights, their privacy, the protection that you're offering those individuals is fundamental to the core of the service that you are developing on an ongoing basis.
It's really interesting, isn't it, how the whole concept of security by design and privacy by design are so integrated and linked one with the other. Because by adopting that security by design as one of the foundational principles of privacy by design, it seems to me that the framework has aimed to ensure that data protection and privacy are not only achieved in compliance with the law, but also as a matter of sort of good practice and almost ethical responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. And it all starts with like that whole kind of network design framework. And I think, yeah, tell us more about that.
Well, I wish I could. No,
I wish you could.
I was working with an organisation last year who really were sort of staring down the barrel of what do we do with the data that we've collected? How are we going to be handling GDPR? Because we've got this data sitting over here. Do we really need it? So the first thing that these guys did was take a look at the data that they had and minimized it and decided that they asked the question, what is the minimum amount of data we need to hold to be able to accurately deliver the service that our clients are paying us for? And they did a fantastic job of getting it down to about 3/4 prime pieces of personal information, none of which, if and on its own, would be able to identify the end user. So they were sort of quite proud of that. And they achieved this by using containerization and building stuff within Kubernetes. So things would be spun up when required for doing the identity, as it were. So you'd have your identity container, which would authenticate the user or the device as they logged into the platform. Once they passed that hurdle, they were then able to spin up the security container, which would then provide them with the permissions that their access had granted them. This in turn then passed on to the access container, which reviewed both the security and the authorization that had been granted and determined where they could go within the within the landscape that the guys within the application that the team had built. And it was pretty successful, and it was a really interesting eye-opening to me understanding of how you can use software to enhance the security that you can provide to your end users, especially as you were like trimming down the amount of data that you were storing and keeping it to an absolute minimum so that you can provide back to your clients exactly what it was they needed. And of course, one of the driving factors of this was that overarching threat of GDPR fines and non-compliance, because it's almost the threat of non-compliance, I think, that got organisations busy and made them sort of pull their socks up and have a look in their cupboards and see what data they were holding, because the fear of being fined, like 4% of your annual turnover, is enormous and could put companies out of business. So it kind of cost a lot for organisations to get compliant, didn't it, Kev?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure everyone who's listening to this will have gone through the painful experience of somebody going, oh, yeah, there's this GDPR thing coming on. We need to do something about it. And then preparing for that and spinning up a project and finding the resources in order to put in a privacy program that addressed the needs of the encroaching legislation that was coming, and of course driven by the fear factor of these big fines that were going to come down on people. And we saw that kind of broken down into a number of key areas. I mean, obviously there's legal and consulting fees, so dependent on the scale of the organizations, going to their external counsel or internal counsel, or to specialist consulting services to understand how to interpret the requirements of GDPR and how to start on that journey of compliance and putting the strategies and processes in place. So that in itself, we all know lawyers are expensive. They're even more expensive than we are. Technology and software. I mean, absolutely. There's a whole realm and a whole marketplace that's opened in terms of the technology and software that's come around to help us remain compliant. So systems like OneTrust, for instance, is one big player in that space to help remain compliant to legislative requirements. And then, of course, you can't just put it in without telling everyone about it. So everyone has to go through a training program in order to understand the implications, how to handle data, how to deal with requests, how to talk to their clients, so people on the help desk, what can they share, what can't they share. So the rules didn't necessarily change, but the impact of not following those rules did. So there's a number of requirements, and the fact is the implementation of GDPR, whilst that in itself was a huge cost and a big project, unfortunately it's a lifestyle choice, and we are all still paying to support our organizations in order to remain on the right side of compliance to GDPR and other standards. There were, data audits and assessments. That's an ongoing thing, something that I love to do with our clients and help them understand what does their data universe look like, and to evaluate them against some of those standards. Dependent on the scale and size and complexity of an organization, DPOs may be required. Not necessarily the cheapest people in the world, because you're looking for people with a data legislative background and or legal background to be able to provide the best counsel possible to ensure that the processes are embedded within your organization. And then,
it's such a role, isn't it, that DPO role, because it's not just looking at what's within your organisation or within the country that you're dealing with. It's also where are your clients coming from, and what are the rules in the land that your clients are based. So DPOs have to have such a broad knowledge to be able to be truly effective in that role.
Absolutely, and in the inception of GDPR, it was a brave person that stuck his hand up and said, yes, I want to be that person, because I'm going to put myself in the firing line should this organization fail to meet its obligations to those data subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Kevin.
So there was more security measures. That was a thing. We've obviously talked about how that sits alongside and hand in glove with the privacy components to ensure that the protections were in place around the data that we're trying to keep private. Documentation, record keeping. All of a sudden, you need somebody who is managing a ROPA. What's one of those? Keeping track of all of the data processing activities in an organization, making sure that they are meeting the requirements of ICO on an ongoing basis. Data breach response, so enhancements to the incident management process, whereby that poor DPO then has to contact the ICO within 72 hours and say, yeah, something bad's happened. And how does that organization manage that and have an approach to the potential reputational damage that can come about from losing somebody's most precious data? And then, we mentioned that ongoing compliance component, which is, year on year, month on month, we're having to ensure that not only do we remain compliant to GDPR, but of course, as you mentioned, Steve, where's our data coming from? Who are our clients? Where are they based? Are we moving into new territories? Are we expanding our organization? And what new legislations are on the horizon, or changes to our existing ones that we need to stay one step ahead of? And if we don't, and if we aren't managing that effectively, what we are going to see is our data subjects asking for that data to update it, interact with it, or delete it from our services. And what does that look like, Steve?
It's a bit of a minefield, if I'm honest with you, because the real worry for most organisations was the threat of multiple DSARs, data subject access requests. And I think at the bottom of that previous slide, we could see that banks spent on average £79 million getting themselves GDPR compliant. And there was a report by Accenture that looked at the banking industry, and they said that the UK industry spent an estimated 1.3 billion, that's a B, on GDPR compliance in 2018, which is about 4 times what was shown on that graph, which was way more than any other European country. The report also found that UK banks hired an average of 19 new employees each to deal with GDPR-related issues such as data protection, data governance, data quality. And this was on the back of the requirement for transparency and decision-making that the regulation was calling for. And there was the cost of servicing the DSAR, which a survey by Thomson Reuters revealed that UK banks expected to receive an average of 89 DSARs per month in 2018, which was a 172% increase from the previous year, 2017. And the survey also said that, or worked out, that the average cost of responding to a DSAR was £3,000, which meant banks could face approximately an annual cost of 32 million for a DSAR response. And on the graph here, we can see the average UK cost at that £3,000, as specified by Thomson Reuters. We got approximately 41% of businesses were paying between £3,000 to £5,000 to respond to DSARs. So if we just assume that each bank received an average of 89 DSARs per month, as estimated by Reuters, and that works out approximately £3.2 million per year just in servicing DSARs alone. It's in order to make that whole DSAR process a little more practical, really, the first step was to review the data held. And this is where we go back to the company that I spent a bit of time with last year, where they minimised the amount of data they were holding, which meant that they were able to be more efficient and effective in responding to DSARs. Because if you haven't got a lot of data to go through, it's not going to take you half as much time to get out the responses that you need. And of course, there are other companies that didn't manage to be as compliant with the requirements from the GDPR. For example, there was British Airways, who got done 22 million for with breaches which involved both personal and credit card data. Came up to approximately 400,000 of their customers' data was stolen, which included employee login details, payment card numbers. Then there was Google, who got done 100 million. They were fined by the French data regulator CNIL. There's a separate 60 million from CNIL and 40 million from Ireland for violating GDPR and French data protection legislation. WhatsApp, we all use WhatsApp. Well, we forget that they were fined 225 million for by the Irish data protection watchdog for breaching GDPR. And champion of them all was Amazon, who got fined 746 million from the European Union for violating GDPR. This was the Luxembourg National Commission for Data Protection, the CMPD, who imposed the fine in a decision on July 16th, which was disclosed by Amazon in a regulatory filing a little while later. The Luxembourg fine dwarfs anything that has been imposed before, and it still stands, I think, as the biggest GDPR fine ever.
Yeah,
so, Kev,
a lot of money.
What have we learned? Have we learned anything?
What have we learned? well, what we've learned is don't get on the wrong side of it in a really big way, because it's going to be quite expensive. Although, having said that, we do have to take into account the financial resources of those organisations being fined, and how painful was it really, or was it in a slush fund? But nonetheless, it has driven increased accountability. So what we are clear about is, irrespective of how painful those fines are, they have been levied, that those organisations have been held to account for the protections and privacy of personal data from the people that they call their customers, who are supposed to be central to their success, which is absolutely critical. And we've really learned a lot about consent and transparency. So a few years ago, in a pre-GDPR world, I don't think we ever really considered these components or understood what that could mean. But essentially, now as individuals, we are expected to consent to the use of our data in a number of different ways to ensure that what happens to that information is what we expect to, and that we understand what's happening. And that kind of accountability which sits on the data controllers to offer that transparency of the services that they are using, how they're using our data, the extent to which it is shared, to whom it is being shared with, whether it's changing borders and being processed by a company somewhere else, and to validate why that's appropriate and why they need to do that in order to provide you the services that you may be paying for. Data minimization, again, something we probably never thought of before, and I'm sure many, especially marketing companies, were hit hard with the introduction of GDPR, where contact information was absolutely crucial to the success of marketing campaigns, and it was gathered indiscriminately from around the web, and people were automatically opted in to receive marketing communication. Now, as to your point earlier with that other organization, the privacy by design component and the requirement to minimize the amount of data is absolutely critical. You know, there is no need to understand my birth date for most services that I sign up for. I mean, it's just not necessary. And to your point, any data that you do not need, that you do not have a valid purpose for having, is a risk, not a benefit. So if you've got it and you don't need it, it's a risk if you get fined, and you've got to pay to store it. And let's be honest, we store so much data now, it's starting to get expensive. There's a lot of organizations trying to reduce their footprint in places like AWS data centers and Azure data centers in order to keep their costs down. So don't have it. And, you know, as we mentioned before, enhanced security measures, you know, they have been critical to the improvements around our ability to provide the privacy that the data requires. We'll not say anything about, you know, BA and their inability to put enhanced security measures in, and hence losing that data and getting fined horribly. But these are the consequences for not being aware of how to keep that data safe effectively. And of course, as we mentioned before, that continuous globalization of data legislation reaching any number of different countries and territories, which is now providing that overarching framework of legislative protection around our privacy rights.
It's really interesting. I want to just pick up on the consent and transparency issue, because we're always talking and sort of always considering consent and transparency from the perspective of the data subject, but that also spills over into B2B engagements, where you have to explain to your prospective clients, your suppliers and your supply chain, and where those suppliers are located, particularly if you're a data controller and you have data processors who are down the line. And that consent and transparency then becomes, you're asking the person to whom you're offering your services for their consent to be able to share their data with your data processor, who might be based in Romania or might be based in America. And where is the company, the client that you're pitching that data for could be based in Europe, and they may not be comfortable with that data being shared with a processor in America or a processor in Romania. So that consent and transparency issue, I think, is a lot bigger than just dealing with your data subject. And although that's important, I think it has far-reaching impacts. Yeah.
Absolutely, completely agree.
This is where we have to start looking at that whole future of data privacy and where it's going, because there's our buddies, the ICO, who are going to be there probably enforcing stricter regulation, stricter enforcement. And I think we could see that happening around us as we speak. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, we have the online safety bill which is coming, which is going to be enforcing and regulating freedom of speech on the internet. And you know that that's only going to trickle down now through other legislation, which is going to control how people are doing business and to minimize the number of data breaches and to control government data and making sure that because if I'm not mistaken, over the weekend, the vehicle database got hacked. The vehicle licensing database got hacked. The implications of that, if that was a real and genuine attack, is that it's going to put a lot of the efforts that are trying to be moved forward, such as ULEZ, and all of the parking fines and speeding fines will no longer be able to be facilitated because they can't get access to the database. So there's all sorts of regulation that should probably come into play on the back of the advances in technology that we're seeing going on around us. And then
Absolutely.
You've got that whole.
So I was just going to say, Steve, you should drive your car where you can then, before it costs you to take off the driveway.
I have lost my car a long time ago. I'm down to bicycles. I'm quite safe. But that's the whole thing, isn't it? It's really about the ethics around how we're using data and what data is used for. It's because
you're absolutely right, Steve, and it's fascinating. I find this really interesting in that the data privacy and data ethics is where we're going in terms of how do we consider protections going forward. And I can't quite get my arms around it or my brain around it in the moment, but pretty much it feels like current data legislation really understands the information that describes who I am. And what I am, and that is the data that I am looking to keep safe. That I, as an individual, cannot be identified by that data that is held by an organization. But more interestingly, is that starting to extend to what I do. So what do I do when I'm in your application? Is that data mine or yours? I'm using your application and I've signed up to your terms and conditions, but what are you able to understand from my behaviors about who I am from that data? And we're seeing more of that being unpicked by the ever increasing capabilities of AI systems to be able to understand what my next move is, what I'm likely to do, what I'm likely to want. I mean, everybody's experienced the is my phone listening to me situation where Google suddenly seems to know exactly what I wanted, and I really wanted those shoes in brown, and because other people like me, having performed these activities, now want this stuff. Is that useful? Maybe. Is it a bit creepy? Quite often. But the concept of how that data is used and how that is likely to transfer to surveillance. So the understanding of what you're doing on the internet extending to what you're doing in the street. We live in the most monitored country in the world with more cameras than anywhere else. How well is that able to identify how I move around the world as well? But I think what we're going to see is the increase in focus around this area.
That's really interesting as well. And it is a cause for concern, isn't it? The fact that there is all of that CCTV data that is being sucked up and is being looked at. And we don't know what controls there are in place and for what use it's going to be. We can only assume it's for our benefit. But it's interesting to realise that 65% of the world is going to be covered by personal data regulation by the end of this year. That's an estimated 65% of the globe. And that's really, I think, falls under the impact of what the GDPR has done. It's Brazil, for example, brought in the I'm not even going to try to pronounce that because Brazilian Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese is hard. We'll just go with the LGPD to protect the data for its population, for the persons living there. In Japan, you had the APPI, the Act on the Protection of Personal Information. South Africa, we had the POPIA, the Protection of the Personal Information Act. And India, they're still debating the Personal Data Protection Bill. And it's interesting when you think about all these organizations, all these countries that are bringing into place all these personal data regulations to look after their citizens, because we're really looking at a future of data privacy and AI and quantum computing. And I don't know, but it just is a little bit of a fear, a little bit of a worry. We've got all these improved encryption methods coming our way. We've got homomorphic encryption, which is allegedly coming, where data can be acted upon without it being unencrypted. We're having all these increased algorithms being created. So, I mean, where do you think this is going to go, Kev? What have you been exposed to?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting in terms of the impact of quantum computing, and I think what you're going to see is some early adopters and those that are technology forward, ensuring that they are protected effectively from the potential threats of quantum computing being able to impact their systems, to steal their data, to break the encryption levels that currently exist today. And that includes the kind of requirements to increasingly encrypt and obfuscate that data. And realistically, what I've seen this week actually is a client that we work with, Flow Health, have literally taken this to the next level in that they are able to provide their services in reaction to changing legislation in America to their clients in an anonymous mode. So essentially, no organization holds enough information to be able to identify that individual. So they are able to use those services with utter protection. And that no organization can request data on an individual because they don't know who they are. They simply are able to provide their services to anonymous individuals, so they are able to take advantage of the product that they produce. And
That's
that
incredible.
it's incredible, and it includes post-quantum encryption to be able to ensure, should that data ever be impacted in any way, it couldn't be unpicked by early quantum computing anyway. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, it's literally seen the future.
Huh. So how does what is that? Is that federated access controls that they're using? Or any little hints towards where we're going there, Kev?
So, I mean, essentially, that's oblivious HTTPS, and they are actually offering this. I mean, I'd like to say that I am knowledgeable about the technology, but it extends beyond my current understanding. But they are actually offering this as a open source capability to organizations to be able to understand how they've achieved it and to be able to implement those things for themselves.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks, man. So that is almost the future of data privacy then, and the impact of AI, because AI is using cameras and software to identify and track people. We've got AI can use sensors and algorithms to measure and analyze physical or biological characteristics. We've got behavioral patterns being used. And all of this stuff is coming down the line towards us. And the EU is one of a number of countries that are developing regulation for AI, including,
Yes.
alongside that, we've got the United States who are working on AI, but they're sort of doing it in a distributed fashion across different federal agencies. We've got Japan looking at running AI regulation. China released draft regulation on AI April 3rd. We've got the UK looking to introduce measures, and Canada's Parliament is considering its own hotly contested Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. So the future's coming. it's going to be a different
Absolutely.
future.
I mean, the other thing that we've seen coming that's heading our way soon is there's actually a legislation around the Internet of Things that all products that are connected in some way will have to meet security requirements.
And it's crazy that they didn't have that in from day one, that you could build something which didn't have a layer of security in it from the start. That's always been a wonder to me that happened.
Absolutely. So at all ends of the spectrum, from the connected toaster to the complex systems, we're seeing improvements in and extensions to legislative requirements, both in terms of security and in terms of privacy, to ensure that framework is keeping us as safe as possible.
It's really interesting to pick up on that, Kev, because the EU AI Act specifically is stating that they're going to outlaw or devices that can influence and work on people, and they specify cognitive behavioral manipulation of people or specific vulnerable groups. For example, voice-activated toys that encourage dangerous behavior in children. And if anyone is just thinking that that's like a bizarre and wacky, off-the-wall piece of regulation, I just want to remind folks that there were the baby alarms that used to get hacked not so long ago, and you used to have those mysterious voices coming across and telling the kids, yeah, why don't you just go and pick up that pillow and hit your teddy? And even that kind of insidious behavior is out there and happening. So we do need regulation, we do need control.
Absolutely. And that's being supported as well by age-appropriate design requirements that are being incorporated into GDPR to ensure that services provided online and through apps meet appropriate age requirements for all children.
Absolutely. Well, that sort of brings us to the end of our chit chat on the 5 years of GDPR. We've been Kevin Swatridge, the spry Kevin Swatridge, and I'm the old boy, Steve Giancarlo. We've been working for the ZDL Group, and ZDL Group we provide a cyber services designed to take a holistic approach, focusing on key areas of cyber resilience. We do what we call a 360 cybersecurity approach, where we look at ethical hacking, training, managed services, and our speciality, compliance. Thank you very much to those of you that were with us. We have 2 more webinars coming up. On the 22nd of November, we'll be looking at the benefits that a broad level security review can provide an organisation. And then on the 24th of January, we're going to be looking at the changes to ISO 27001 and how they're sort of bringing that up to date. If there are any questions, then we'll have a look in the chat and we'll respond to those. But I'd just like to say thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again on the 22nd of November. Should have a theme tune now, shouldn't we, really?